They said the forest had taken him. But when a hiker's dog found his shoes, 12 years later, police knew someone had been there first. It was November in Fairbrook, Oregon. The kind of morning where the fog swallows sound, and every tree looks like it's keeping a secret. Grace Harlow had walked the cold pine trails for years. She knew the safe loops, the tricky inclines, and the places you never went alone. But that morning Jasper, her golden retriever, darted off the path, nose down, tail stiff. She called after him. No answer. By the time she caught up, Jasper was pawing at something half buried under damp pine needles beside a decaying log. A pair of sneakers, small, red, caked in mud. One lace torn away completely, the other frayed to threads. Grace froze. These weren't the kind of shoes you'd expect to see out here. Not this deep. Not this far from the trail. Her first thought, a lost hiker. A child. Injured somewhere nearby. But the forest was silent, the air heavy. Not even the wind moved the branches. She took a photo and pulled Jasper back toward the trail. She didn't call 911. Not yet. She told herself she'd send it to a friend on the local search and rescue team, just to be sure. Hours later, the image was on a police desk. The brand, the size, the scuffed stripe along the side, they matched an entry in the evidence database. 2 weeks later, the results came back. The shoes belonged to Tyler Quinn, a boy who had vanished from Camp Echo Valley in July of 2011. 9 years old. Last seen walking toward the woods with a flashlight, telling his cabin mate he was going to meet the whistling man. The search back then had been relentless. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers combing every ridge and hollow. Not a single footprint. Not a single scrap of clothing. And now, the first physical trace in over a decade. It should have been a breakthrough. But there was one problem. The condition of the shoes didn't match 12 years in the forest. The mud was fresh. The stitching intact. Even the rubber soles showed little sign of decay. Someone had placed them there recently. Which meant someone had been keeping them. Which meant Tyler's story, wherever it had gone, had just been pulled back into the present. Within hours, detectives were in Cold Pine Forest, scanning the ground for disturbances, mapping the area where the sneakers were found. The clock was ticking again. Because if Tyler Quinn had lived long enough for someone to keep his shoes, there was a chance, however small, that he was still alive. In July of 2011, Camp Echo Valley sat tucked deep within the sprawling Cold Pine Forest, its weathered cabins and wooden docks a relic of a simpler time. The camp had been running for decades, promising parents a week or two where their children could breathe fresh air, hike rugged trails, and fall asleep to the sound of crickets instead of television static. Tyler Quinn had never been away from home before. He had just celebrated his 9th birthday with a small cake and a few neighborhood friends. 4 weeks leading up to camp, his mother, Karen, had gone back and forth in her mind, wondering if it was too soon, if her son was ready. Tyler was gentle by nature, the kind of boy who avoided loud games and preferred reading about animals to joining the others in rowdy sports. He was thoughtful, quiet, and deeply attached to the familiar comfort of home. But Tyler had insisted. He wanted to show his mom he could be brave. He had read about Camp Echo Valley in a brochure his school handed out, with pictures of kids paddling canoes, sitting around campfires and sleeping under star-filled skies. To him, it looked like an adventure he couldn't pass up. The first 2 days went as expected. Letters home later revealed he'd been shy at meals, slow to make friends, but was beginning to enjoy the nature walks and arts and crafts sessions. His counselor, a 19-year-old college student named Ben Willis, described him as reserved but curious. Tyler wasn't the kind to wander far from the group, until the third night. July 14, 2011. That evening, the sky was streaked with orange and gold as the sun sank behind the pines. Dinner was served in the lodge. Spaghetti, bread rolls, and cups of powdered lemonade. Afterward, most of the campers gathered for the traditional campfire, singing songs and roasting marshmallows. Tyler had been there at first, but he didn't stay long. At around 9 p.m., one of his cabin mates, a boy named Ryan Keller, saw him quietly packing a small flashlight into the pocket of his hoodie. Ryan, curious, asked where he was going. Tyler's reply was strange, almost casual. "I'm going to meet the whistling man." Ryan thought it was a joke. He didn't ask any more questions. Later, counselors would testify that they saw Tyler near the edge of the main trail that led toward the forest. He wasn't running or hiding, just walking slowly, flashlight in hand. The path he took led away from the cabins and toward the older, less-used sections of the camp property. No one followed him. By 10 p.m., Tyler had not returned. Ben Willis checked the cabin, thinking maybe Tyler had gone to bed early. His bunk was empty. His sleeping bag was neatly folded back. His shoes were missing. When the counselors realized he was gone, they searched the immediate area with their own flashlights. They called his name over and over, expecting him to pop out from behind a tree or return laughing about some secret game. But there was only the soft rush of wind through the branches. By sunrise, when there was still no sign of him, the camp director phoned 911. The search began immediately. The local sheriff's department arrived with tracking dogs, while volunteers from Fairbrook and nearby towns joined in. Helicopters circled overhead. Search teams fanned out, combing every inch of the forest. They checked the lake, overturned fallen logs, and scoured the riverbanks. But Tyler Quinn had left no trace. No footprints in the damp soil. No torn pieces of clothing snagged on branches. Not a single broken twig to suggest the direction he'd gone. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. That night, the search continued under floodlights. The dogs picked up a faint scent near the north trail but lost it abruptly at a clearing just beyond camp property. Authorities were baffled. People didn't just vanish without a sign, especially not children. Then, during a sweep of Tyler's cabin, a counselor found something under his pillow, a half-written letter to his mother. The handwriting was small, neat, with a few smudges where the pencil had pressed too hard. "Dear Mom, I'm not scared anymore. I think he's nice. He said he lives in the trees." Karen read the note over and over when police gave it to her. The words made no sense. Who was he? Why would Tyler be afraid at first, and then suddenly trust this person? And what did it mean to live in the trees? Investigators questioned every camper and staff member. Most had never heard Tyler mention the whistling man. But a few claimed they'd heard strange noises at night, faint melodies drifting through the trees, almost like someone whistling an old tune. None could pinpoint where it came from. One camper, an 11-year-old named Lucy, told police she'd seen a tall figure near the treeline the night before Tyler vanished. She described him as wearing something dark, and not moving like a normal person. Her statement was dismissed as imagination. By the end of the week, the search was scaled back. The official theory was that Tyler had wandered too far, gotten lost, and likely succumbed to the elements. But Karen refused to believe it. She knew her son would never run away without a reason, and certainly not without saying goodbye. The letter haunted her. Authorities released Tyler's photo to the public, along with a description of the clothes he'd been wearing: a gray hoodie, dark shorts, and red sneakers. Hundreds of tips came in, but none led to him. By September, the case went cold. The camp closed for the season, but rumors lingered. Some kids said the whistling man was a ghost. Others whispered about a hermit who lived deep in cold pine forest, luring children away. Karen returned to the camp the following summer on her own. She walked the same trail Tyler had taken, stopping at the clearing where the scent had been lost. The trees stood silent, towering over her, their shadows stretching long and thin in the afternoon sun. She listened. No voices. No movement. Just the wind and the occasional creak of branches. But every so often she swore she could hear it, faint and distant. A whistle. Slow, steady, and terribly out of place. As the seasons passed, Tyler Quinn's case slid further into silence. The media stopped calling. Search parties stopped forming. Even the official investigation grew faint, buried under newer tragedies. By 2014, Camp Echo Valley was a shadow of its former self. Bookings dropped, parents pulled their children from the summer roster, and the once busy lodge grew quiet. That year, 2 campers claimed they had heard whistling in the woods during a night hike. Both described it as slow, drawn-out notes. Not a song exactly, but something rhythmic, almost deliberate. Camp officials brushed it off as overactive imagination. Still, whispers spread. Staff muttered about the Echo Man, a name that had been floating around Fairbrook for decades. The Echo Man was said to be a hermit who roamed cold pine forest long before the camp was built. Some stories painted him as a recluse driven mad by loss. Others said he had been a musician who once played in the town square, until an unknown scandal sent him into hiding. In every version, his whistle was his call, a lure that reached children first. Those who followed the sound were never seen again. Locals swapped the tale in hushed voices, embellishing it with each retelling. Hunters claimed to have heard faint melodies echoing through the valleys, even in winter. A few swore they had glimpsed a figure watching from the tree line, tall and still as stone. Police dismissed these accounts as campfire stories. Folklore, nothing more. But Karen Quinn never stopped believing there was truth buried somewhere inside the legend. Each year on Tyler's birthday, she drove out to the edge of cold pine forest. She tacked missing person flyers to trail signs, left candles at the entrance, and walked the paths alone, scanning every shadow. Friends urged her to move on. She ignored them. She still had the letter found under his pillow. She still heard his voice when she read it. By 2023, 12 years had passed since her son disappeared. And then came the phone call. The sneakers discovered by hiker Grace Harlow had been identified beyond doubt as Tyler's. The news shattered the stillness Karen had been living in. She clutched the phone, listening to the detective's voice, feeling both hope and dread knot tightly in her chest. That same week, investigators re-entered the forest. The renewed search wasn't publicized at first. They didn't want to stir up crowds or scare off anyone who might be watching. The team moved slowly, methodically. Metal detectors swept the ground. Dogs sniffed for human remains. It was in a dense cluster of trees about 50 yards from where the shoes had been uncovered that an officer spotted something peculiar, a faded nylon strap looped around a branch. It wasn't a trap or a signpost. It was a trail camera, the kind hunters used to track wildlife. The casing was cracked. Moss had crept along the edges. The device looked like it had been there for years, maybe even before the camp closed. The camera was removed carefully and sent to the lab. Miraculously, the memory card inside still held data. When the images were finally recovered, they revealed mostly ordinary frames. Deer passing through, raccoons sniffing at the lens, branches swaying in the wind. Then, as the tech flipped through, one photograph froze the room. It was dated July 15, 2011, the morning after Tyler vanished. The shot showed a young boy barefoot standing in a small clearing. His hair was mussed, his expression a mix of fear and confusion. He wasn't looking at the camera, he was staring off to the side toward something just out of view. But that wasn't what chilled the investigators most. In the blurred background, partially hidden among the thick summer leaves, was the faint outline of a man. Tall. Hood drawn over his head. What could have been a mask, long, pale, with hollow black eyes, obscured the face. It was impossible to tell if it was real skin or something crafted to conceal identity. The man's posture was rigid, unnatural. He wasn't moving, yet there was an undeniable sense of intent, as though he was waiting. The room went silent when the image hit the monitor. If the photograph was genuine, then Tyler had been alive hours after his disappearance, and he had not been alone. The sheriff's department forwarded the file to the FBI. A joint task force was formed within days. Agents visited the site where the camera had been mounted, hoping to find any trace of whoever set it up. They found none. Questions multiplied. Was the image a hoax planted years earlier to stir fear? Could someone have staged it using another child? Or was it tangible proof that the boy had been taken, and that the Echo Man was not just a fireside legend? Karen was shown the picture under controlled conditions. She pressed her hand to her mouth and nodded. "That's Tyler," she whispered. "That's my baby." But when asked if she recognized the man in the hood, she only shook her head. The public learned of the photograph weeks later, when an anonymous source leaked it to a local news station. Overnight, the image was everywhere, grainy, eerie, endlessly analyzed. Forums filled with theories. Some claimed the mask was actually the bleached skull of an animal, worn to terrify. Others thought the eyes were nothing more than shadows created by sunlight. Whatever it was, the legend of the Echo Man grew teeth again. People began reporting new sightings. A hunter swore he'd seen a figure in the forest that January, taller than any man he'd ever met, gliding rather than walking. 2 teenagers claimed they heard slow, deliberate whistling while driving past the cold pine trailhead at dusk. Authorities investigated each report but found nothing tangible. Still, one thing was certain: the photo changed everything. The case could no longer be written off as a simple disappearance. There was a human presence in those woods that night, someone who had stood within feet of a missing boy. And if that someone was still out there, they had been hiding for a very, very long time. 2 months had passed since the photograph surfaced. The investigation into Tyler Quinn's disappearance had shifted from cold case paperwork to an active, relentless search. Law enforcement combed the cold pine forest with new precision. Drones overhead, thermal imaging equipment scanning the undergrowth, cadaver dogs moving in wide, deliberate arcs. On a windless February morning, one of those dogs froze mid-step, its nose pressed low to the ground. The handler called it in. The animal began pawing at a patch of dirt wedged between 2 boulders in a narrow gully. The earth there was darker, looser, as though it had been disturbed many times. Searchers moved in with shovels, clearing away moss and roots. Then they hit wood. It wasn't a coffin. It was a hatch. The trapdoor had been built flush with the forest floor, covered in layers of pine needles and soil. Rusted hinges groaned when pried open. A stale, sour odor spilled upward, thick enough to make several officers cover their mouths. A ladder descended into darkness. Flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing rough plank walls and a low ceiling braced with scavenged beams. The space wasn't large, perhaps 15 feet long, 10 feet wide, but every inch told a story no one wanted to hear. On one side sat stacks of dented food cans, their labels faded beyond recognition. A pile of tattered blankets lay in the opposite corner, stiff with mildew. Along the far wall, dozens of sheets of paper were pinned or taped haphazardly, each covered in childlike crayon drawings. Crooked trees, figures standing in shadows, stick-figure children holding hands. And there, in a crate, was a stack of empty shoeboxes. Some were labeled in blocky handwriting, first names, sometimes just initials. One box in the middle read, Tyler Q. An evidence team began cataloging everything. Gloves and masks on, they opened each box, finding scraps of fabric, buttons, marbles, and in one, a single blue hair clip. In Tyler's box they found a few dried pine needles, a marble, and clinging to the cardboard flap, a single strand of hair. DNA analysis later confirmed it belonged to Tyler Quinn. The air in that shelter was heavy, almost claustrophobic even with the hatch wide open. Investigators worked in shifts, unwilling to linger too long in the dim, cramped space. Then they found the notebook. It was wedged between two rotting floorboards as if it had been hidden deliberately. The cover was soft, its pages warped from moisture. Inside the handwriting varied, sometimes neat, sometimes scrawled in jagged bursts. But the voice was always the same, a child's. One entry read, "He only comes when you whistle." Another, "He feeds us mushrooms and fish." Several pages later, "Sometimes he takes one of us away and they don't come back." The words were simple, but they chilled the team more than any photograph ever could. The final entry came without warning, just a short, uneven sentence. "If I ever escape, I'll go home. But I don't remember the way." The notebook didn't use names, but the first page carried the faint impression of a signature, TQ scratched lightly in pencil. For Karen Quinn, the discovery was a strange, cruel gift. Proof that her son had been alive long after the search for him had ended. Proof that he had been somewhere real, not vanished into legend, but trapped in a place no one had thought to